Welcome to Relation Tales. Please like this video and subscribe Relation Tales. Tony Callahan leaned back in his chair, and the kitchen table creaked as he moved. His rough hands held a hot cup of coffee, and his knuckles were tight with tension. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, making each second feel longer as he watched Alicia get ready in the living room for another night out. His jaw tightened as he looked at her. Alicia wore a tight red dress that showed off her figure. Her long, dark hair hung down in loose curls, and her face was perfectly done with smoky eyes and red lips, ready for a night of fun. Tony felt a mix of anger and disappointment. This had happened too many times recently, and he was tired of it. He had married Alicia for her lively personality, but now it seemed like she was more interested in partying than in building a life with him. "Alicia," he called, his voice filled with frustration. "This is the third time this month. I told you, I don't want you going to those parties with your so-called friends. Nothing good comes from them." Alicia barely looked at him, still putting on her lipstick in the hallway mirror. "Who do you think you are, telling me what to do? I'm a free woman. I don't need your permission." The dismissive tone in her voice made Tony's blood boil. He slammed his coffee mug down on the table, dark liquid sloshing over the rim and staining the worn wood. In 3 quick strides, he was at the entrance to the hallway, his muscular frame filling the doorway. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm serious, Alicia. I won't tolerate this anymore." Alicia whirled to face him, her eyes flashing with fury. "And who the fuck do you think you are? You don't own me. I'll do whatever I want." She snatched up her purse from the side table, the beaded clutch glinting in the dim light of the hallway. Without another word, she brushed past Tony, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. The front door slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the suddenly silent house. Tony stood there, staring at the closed door, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about months of neglect, of lies, of a growing distance between them that seemed insurmountable. He tried talking, he tried compromising, but nothing seemed to get through to Alicia anymore. As the initial shock of her departure wore off, a cold determination settled over Tony. He wasn't going to let this go, not this time. He needed answers, and he was going to get them tonight. Tony grabbed his jacket from the coat rack and stepped out into the cool night air. He knew where Alicia and her friends usually went, a popular nightclub downtown that always had a long line. But tonight, he wasn't going to party. He was going to find out what his wife had been doing all these nights. The drive downtown passed in a blur of streetlights and honking cars. Tony's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. His mind kept imagining different things he might find, and none of them were good. He parked across the street from the nightclub, the pulsing beat of the music audible even from inside his car. The sidewalk was crowded with people waiting to get in, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the turmoil in Tony's mind. An hour crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Tony's eyes scanned the crowd relentlessly, looking for any sign of Alicia. Just as he was beginning to think she might have gone somewhere else, a taxi pulled up. Tony's breath caught in his throat as he watched Alicia step out, followed by her friend. But it was the third person who emerged from the taxi that made Tony's blood run cold. Jake Donovan. Tony recognized him immediately, the smooth-talking nightclub promoter who always seemed to be hanging around Alicia and her friends. He was younger than Tony, with perfectly styled hair, and the kind of easy charm that Tony had always distrusted. As Tony watched, frozen in his seat, Jake approached Alicia. There was no mistaking the familiarity between them. Alicia's arms wrapped around Jake's neck, her body pressing against his as she laughed at something he said. Jake's hands settled on the small of her back, lower than could be considered friendly. The betrayal hit Tony like a physical blow. He'd suspected, of course, the late nights, the secrecy. The growing distance between them had all made sense now, but seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. For a moment, Tony considered storming across the street, confronting them right there in front of everyone. His hands clenched into fists, the urge to lash out almost overwhelming. But as he watched Alicia place her hand on Jake's chest, laughing up at him as they walked into the club together, a different kind of resolve settled over Tony. This wasn't going to be solved with a public confrontation. No, this required a different approach. Tony started the car, his mind already formulating a plan. He'd confront Alicia, but on his terms when the time was right. Tonight he'd seen enough. The drive home was silent, the radio off as Tony replayed the scene in his mind over and over. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his initial shock had hardened into a cold, implacable anger. Tony didn't bother turning on the lights. He sat in the darkness of the living room, waiting. Hours passed, but Tony hardly moved, his mind focused on what he needed to do. Around 2 a.m., he heard a key in the lock. The front door opened, and Alicia stumbled in, giggling to herself. The smell of alcohol and a strange perfume filled the room as she entered. Tony stayed seated and spoke in a calm but firm voice, breaking the silence. "Get out." Alicia jumped, startled by his presence. She fumbled for the light switch, blinking in confusion as the room was suddenly illuminated. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her words slightly slurred. Tony stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Your things are packed. They're outside. You won't be living here anymore." Alicia's expression shifted from amusement to shock as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She took a step towards him, her hand reaching out. "You're throwing me out? You're serious?" Without a word, Tony walked to the front door and yanked it open. Outside, neatly stacked on the porch, were several suitcases and boxes, all of Alicia's belongings. "Go be with Jake," Tony said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You two deserve each other, and don't come back." The color drained from Alicia's face as she realized Tony knew about Jake. "Wait, Tony," she started, panic creeping into her voice. But Tony was done listening. He took hold of her arm, his grip strong but not hurting her, and led her toward the door. Alicia stumbled onto the porch, her high heels catching on the welcome mat. Before she could turn back, Tony slammed the door shut. The sound of the lock clicking echoed through the house, firm and final. On the other side of the door, Alicia started pounding her fists against it. "We need to talk about this," she cried. But Tony didn't answer. He stood there, listening to her pleas and feeling nothing. The woman he once loved and the life they had shared now felt like a distant memory. As Alicia's cries grew more desperate, Tony turned and walked away from the door. He had decisions to make, a life to rebuild. And for the first time in their marriage, he was putting himself first. In the quiet of the house, Tony pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "It's Tony. I need your help. I want to file for divorce." Tony sat in the sleek office of Samantha Keller, his newly hired divorce attorney. The room was all clean lines and modern furniture, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Tony's life. Samantha, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s, studied the file before her with laser focus. "So, Tony," Samantha began, looking up from the papers, "you want to file for divorce immediately. No separation period. No attempts at reconciliation. Are you absolutely certain about this?" Tony nodded, his jaw set. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Samantha leaned back in her chair, assessing him. "All right, but you should know divorces can get ugly fast, especially when there's infidelity involved. Are you ready for what's coming?" Samantha asked. Tony's eyes grew serious. "I'm not backing down, if that's what you're asking. Alicia made her choice, and now she has to deal with the consequences." "Fair enough," Samantha replied with a hint of approval. "Let's get started then. I'll file the paperwork today. In the meantime, I need you to gather all the evidence you have of Alicia's cheating and reckless spending. Text messages, photos, bank statements, anything you've got." Tony nodded, already mentally cataloging the damning evidence he collected over the past months. "I'll have it all to you by tomorrow." As Tony left Samantha's office, his phone buzzed. Alicia's name flashed on the screen. He declined the call without hesitation. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and tense encounters. Tony threw himself into his work, taking on extra projects to keep his mind occupied. But the real battle was just beginning. One crisp morning, Tony found himself face to face with Alicia and her attorney, Richard Langston, in the first mediation session. The conference room felt claustrophobic, charged with unspoken tension. Richard, a silver-haired man with a predatory smile, spoke first. Mr. Callahan, my client is willing to be reasonable in her demands. Perhaps we can come to an amicable agreement without dragging this out? Tony's eyes flicked to Alicia, who sat with false composure, her hands clasped tightly on the table. He turned back to Richard, his voice cold. There's nothing to discuss. Your client violated our marriage vows and squandered our shared resources. She'll get what she's legally entitled to, nothing more. Alicia's composure cracked. Tony, please, we can fix this. I made a mistake. A mistake? Tony interrupted, his voice angry. Is that what you call months of lying and cheating? Spending our money on parties and your new boyfriend? Richard cleared his throat, trying to calm the situation. Now, Mr. Callahan, let's not make accusations without proof. Samantha jumped in smoothly, pulling out a thick folder. Oh, we have proof, Mr. Langston. Do you want to see the photos of Mrs. Callahan with her friend? Or maybe the credit card statements showing thousands spent at clubs and hotels? Alicia's face turned pale as Samantha showed document after document. Texts, photos, bank records, showing her cheating and reckless spending. You were spying on me? Alicia stammered, shocked. Tony met her gaze unflinchingly. I was protecting myself, and it's a good thing I did. The mediation ended in a stalemate, with Richard requesting time to review the evidence. As they left the room, Alicia grabbed Tony's arm. We need to talk. Privately. Tony shook off her grip. We have nothing to discuss, Alicia. Not anymore. Days turned into weeks as the divorce proceedings dragged on. Tony threw himself into his work, taking on bigger projects and longer hours. The construction site became his refuge, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the legal battles. One evening, as Tony was locking up the site office, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against his truck. Jake! Alicia's lover stood there with an uneasy smile. Hey man, can we talk? Jake called out, his usual smooth demeanor nowhere to be seen. Tony's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice level. There's nothing to talk about. Get lost. Jake raised his hands, trying to calm Tony down. Look, I know you're angry. You have every reason to be. But Alicia, she's really messed up. She regrets everything. Tony laughed, a bitter sound in the quiet evening. You think that makes everything fine? That I should just forgive and forget? No, that's not. Jake began, but Tony interrupted him. Let me make this clear. Tony said, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. I don't care about Alicia's regrets. I don't care about your guilt. You two made your choices. Now you get to live with them. And if I see you around here again, you'll regret it. Understood? Jake swallowed hard, nodding quickly before retreating to his car. Tony watched him drive away, a mixture of anger and disgust churning in his gut. The next day, Tony sat in the courtroom, listening as Alicia's attorney painted a picture of emotional neglect and cold indifference. Richard's voice dripped with false sympathy as he described Alicia as a lonely, misunderstood wife driven to seek comfort elsewhere. My client simply asked for what she's entitled to have for the marital assets, including the house and Mr. Callahan's retirement fund. It's a fair division given the circumstances. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, turned to Samantha. Ms. Keller, your response? Samantha stood, her posture confident. Your Honor, while Mr. Langston's story is dramatic, it's far from the truth. We have evidence that tells a different story. Over the next hour, Samantha carefully showed the proof Tony had collected. Photos of Alicia with Jake, time-stamped text messages about their affair, and bank statements showing Alicia's reckless spending. As you can see, Your Honor, Samantha finished, Mrs. Callahan's cheating and careless spending are well documented. She broke both her marriage vows and her financial duties. We ask that this be considered when dividing the assets. The judge's face stayed expressionless as she looked over the evidence. I'll need time to review all of this thoroughly. We'll reconvene next week for my decision. As they left the courtroom, Tony caught sight of Alicia huddled with her attorney, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, he felt a twinge of something, not quite pity, but a recognition of how far they'd fallen. The week dragged by, each day feeling longer than the last. Tony buried himself in work, staying late at the construction site, going over plans and budgets long after everyone else had gone home. Finally, the day of the judge's decision arrived. Tony sat straight back in the courtroom, his face a mask of calm. Across the aisle, Alicia fidgeted nervously, her eyes darting between Tony and the judge's bench. The judge entered. Her face was serious as she sat down. After carefully looking at all the evidence, "I'm ready to give my decision." Tony held his breath, noticing Alicia doing the same. In the matter of dividing assets, the judge continued, "I rule in favor of Mr. Callahan. Mrs. Callahan's cheating and careless spending have seriously affected the marital estate. Therefore, the house and most of the shared assets will go to Mr. Callahan. Mrs. Callahan will keep her personal belongings and a small part of the savings." Alicia let out a small gasp, quickly silencing herself. Tony stayed still, his face calm. Additionally, the judge said, "Since Mrs. Callahan is currently unemployed and due to the nature of the divorce, no alimony will be given. This decision is final. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room. Tony stood up and firmly shook Samantha's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. As they turned to leave, Alicia rushed over, her eyes wild. "Tony, please, you can't do this to me. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do?" Tony looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months. The woman he had loved was barely recognizable in the desperate figure before him. "You'll do what you always do, Alicia," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll figure it out, but you'll do it without me." With that, Tony walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind the shattered remains of his marriage and the woman who had broken his trust. As he stepped into the sunlight, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The battle was over. He had won, but as he drove home to the house that was now indisputably his, Tony knew that the real challenge lay ahead. Rebuilding his life, learning to trust again, figuring out who he was outside of his failed marriage. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Tony felt ready to face whatever came next. Tony stood at the threshold of his home, key in hand, staring at the front door. The house loomed before him, quiet and still. For the first time in months, he knew he wouldn't find Alicia inside, wouldn't have to brace himself for another argument, or endure the tense silence that had become their norm. He pushed the door open, the familiar creak of hinges echoing through the empty space. The living room was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, dust motes dancing in the light. Tony's footsteps echoed as he walked to the kitchen. Each sound reminded him of how alone he was. He opened the fridge and took a bottle of beer, twisting off the cap easily. He walked to the back porch and sat in his favorite chair. The wood creaked under him as he leaned back and took a long drink of the cold beer. As the sky darkened and turned orange and purple, Tony let out a deep breath. The weight of the past year felt like it was lifting off his shoulders with each moment. The silence that used to feel heavy now felt peaceful. "No more games," Tony muttered to himself, raising his bottle in a toast to himself. He took another sip, enjoying the bitter taste. His mind wandered to the future, which felt full of possibilities. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Suddenly, the sound of his phone ringing interrupted his thoughts. Tony looked at the screen and saw his friend Mark's name. "Hey, Mark," he answered, his voice rough from not speaking much. "Tony, my man." Mark's voice boomed through the phone. "I heard the news." "The divorce is final, huh?" Tony grunted in affirmation. "Yeah, it's done." "Listen," Mark continued, his tone softening slightly. "A bunch of us are heading out for drinks. Why don't you join us? Celebrate your freedom, you know?" Tony hesitated, the invitation stirring a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to stay in his solitude to process everything that had happened. But another part, a part he hadn't listened to in a long time, urged him to accept. "You know what?" Tony said, surprising himself. "I think I will text me the address." An hour later, Tony found himself in a dimly lit bar, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Mark clapped him on the back as he approached the table where his friends were gathered there. "He is," Mark exclaimed, raising his glass to Tony, "a free man." At last the others at the table cheered, lifting their drinks in a toast. Tony felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine one in what felt like ages. As the night wore on, Tony found himself relaxing, the tension of the past months slowly ebbing away. His friends, sensing his mood, kept the conversation light, sharing jokes and stories that had nothing to do with failed marriages or bitter divorces. It was nearing midnight when Sarah, one of his coworkers, leaned in close to be heard over the noise of the bar. "So, Tony," she said, her eyes curious but kind, "what's next for you? Any big plans now that you're single?" Tony paused to think about the question. It was something he had been avoiding. But now, with the alcohol warming him and his friends around him, he felt ready to confront it. "You know," he said slowly, "I think I'm going to focus on work for a while. There's that big project coming up for the new community center. I've been thinking of some ideas to make it really special." Sarah's eyes brightened. "Oh yeah? Like what?" As Tony started to share his ideas, he felt a spark of excitement growing inside him. The more he talked, the more enthusiastic he became, his hands gesturing animatedly as he described his vision. Mark, overhearing the conversation, chimed in. "Sounds like you've got it all figured out, Tony, but don't forget to have some fun too, all right? All work and no play, you know." Tony chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that surprised even him. Yeah, I hear you. Maybe I'll even take that fishing trip we've been talking about for years." The night ended on a high note, with promises to meet up again soon. As Tony climbed into a taxi, he felt lighter than he had in months. The future, which had seemed so bleak just a short time ago, now held promise. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Tony threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, his ideas for the community center project gaining traction with both his team and the clients. One sunny afternoon, as Tony stood on the construction site, hard hat in place and blueprints in hand, he heard a familiar voice call out to him. "Mr. Callahan, do you have a moment?" Tony turned to see Richard Langston, Alicia's former attorney, approaching. The sight of the man sent a jolt of tension through Tony's body, memories of the bitter court battles flooding back. "Mr. Langston," Tony acknowledged, his voice cool. "What can I do for you?" Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearly ill at ease in the dusty construction site. "I wanted to apologize, Mr. Callahan, for everything that happened during the divorce. It was unprofessional of me to push things as far as I did." Tony looked at the man and noticed the signs of stress on his face. "That's what you were paid to do, right? Push things as far as you could?" Richard nodded, looking regretful. "Yes, but let's just say I've had some time to think about my methods. Your ex-wife, she wasn't completely honest with me about your marriage." Tony's jaw tightened at the mention of Alicia. "Is that so?" "Yes," Richard continued, his voice low. "She's been struggling since the divorce. Tried to file a complaint against me with the Bar Association, claiming I mishandled her case. It didn't go anywhere, of course, but it made me realize some things." Tony remained silent, waiting for Richard to get to the point. "Anyway," Richard said, clearing his throat, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry and, well, I admire how you handled yourself throughout the whole ordeal. It couldn't have been easy." Tony considered the man's words, feeling the last vestiges of anger towards him fade away. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. I appreciate you saying that." As Richard walked away, Tony turned back to his blueprints, his mind already refocusing on the task at hand. The encounter, brief as it was, felt like the closing of a chapter. Weeks turned into months, and Tony found himself settling into a new rhythm. His days were filled with work, his evenings with a mix of quiet solitude and occasional outings with friends. The house, once a reminder of his failed marriage, slowly became a sanctuary. One crisp fall evening, as Tony was leaving his office, he ran into Sarah in the parking lot. "Hey, Tony," she called out, waving as she walked home. Tony nodded and smiled a little. "Yeah, I thought I'd call it a day." Sarah paused for a moment, then seemed to decide something. "Actually, I was wondering if you'd like to grab dinner. There's this new Italian place I've been wanting to try." Tony blinked, surprised by the invitation. He looked at Sarah's face and noticed a hint of nervousness in her eyes. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of panic, old fears and doubts threatening to surface. But then he took a deep breath, pushing those feelings aside. This wasn't Alicia, this was Sarah, someone he'd known and respected for years. Someone who had been there for him during the darkest days of his divorce. "You know what?" Tony said, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. "That sounds great. Lead the way." As they walked to Sarah's car, chatting easily about work and mutual friends, Tony felt a sense of possibility unfurling within him. He wasn't ready for another serious relationship, not yet. But friendship? Companionship? Those were things he could embrace. The Italian restaurant was cozy and warm, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce filling the air. As they settled into their seats, Tony found himself relaxing, the conversation flowing easily. "So," Sarah said, taking a sip of her wine, "I heard the community center project is really taking off. The designs looked amazing in the last meeting." Tony nodded, a spark of pride igniting in his chest. "Yeah, it's coming along well. We got some great ideas for making it really functional for the neighborhood. Energy efficient, too." As he started to explain the plans, Tony felt that familiar excitement building. He talked about the solar panels they were adding, the community garden space, and the multipurpose rooms designed for everything from job training to art classes. Sarah listened closely, her eyes shining with interest. "Tony, that's incredible. You've really put a lot of effort into this project, haven't you?" Tony paused to think about her words. "I guess I have," he said slowly. "After everything that happened, it felt good to focus on creating something positive, you know?" Sarah reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "I think it's wonderful. You should be proud of yourself, Tony. Not just for the project, but for how you've handled everything this past year." Tony felt a warm spread through him at her words, a feeling that had nothing to do with the wine they were drinking. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot." As they finished their meal and stepped out into the cool night air, Tony felt a sense of contentment wash over him. The future, which had once seemed so uncertain, now felt full of promise. "This was nice," he said, turning to Sarah. "We should do it again sometime." Sarah smiled, her eyes twinkling in the street light. "I like that, Tony. I like that a lot." As Tony drove home that night, he found himself humming along to the radio, a habit he'd all but forgotten in the stress of the past year. The house, when he pulled into the driveway, didn't loom over him as it once had. Instead, it felt like a welcome sight, a place of peace and possibility. Stepping inside, Tony kicked off his shoes and made his way to the back porch. He settled into his favorite chair, looking out over the backyard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the landscape. Tony took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The anger he had felt for so long, the bitterness over Alicia's betrayal, and the stress of the divorce all seemed to fade away. In their place was a quiet strength and a determination to move forward. He thought about the community center project and the difference it would make in people's lives. He thought about his friends who had stood by him during his toughest times. And he thought about Sarah, the warmth of her smile, and the chance for new beginnings. Tony wasn't naive. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, with moments of doubt and difficulty. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them. He had survived the storm of his failed marriage and come out stronger. As the night grew darker, Tony let himself smile. The past was behind him now, a closed chapter. The future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities, stretched out before him. And Tony Callahan was ready to take it one day at a time. Second story. I, 18M, just found out that my now ex-boyfriend, 19M, of 7 months cheated on me with my now ex-best friend, 18F, and I feel really terrible. I know I can be insecure in relationships and have trust and jealousy issues that I've been trying to work on, but it's been tough, and I sometimes acted out because of how I was feeling. Still, I don't think I deserved what happened. I had been suspicious that he was cheating on me with her, but I kept doubting myself. He was always kind and respectful, buying me things I asked for, which I now think he did out of guilt. He had some unusual preferences that he would ask me to try, and I always said, maybe in the future, even though I never planned to. I was worried that if I said no, he would leave me. 2 days before I found out about the cheating, I asked him if I could see his Snapchat account to ease my mind. He said, "I don't want to give it to you, because I know it would just make you more anxious." I felt hurt, but thought he might be right, and I might just find something else to worry about. Then, 2 days later, my best friend refused to open his snaps in front of me. She was responding to everyone else, but skipped his messages, which felt suspicious. While walking home from college, I told him I wanted to look through their messages. He hesitated but agreed. When I looked, I found horrible videos of the unusual things he had asked me to try. I went home crying, feeling lost, and she even messaged me, claiming she accidentally sent the videos and was mad at him for saving them. I knew that was a lie, so I told her I never wanted to hear from her again and to be with him. For almost 2 weeks, no one believed me or asked for my side of the story, which made me feel crazy, so I quit college. Eventually, people started asking questions and realized how dishonest they both were and finally supported me, but the damage was already done. Now, I feel alone, sad, and anxious, and I don't know what to do with myself. Thanks for reading this. I just needed to get it off my chest.